I'm just trying to make people aware of the story that's repeated over and over again, and looks like where we are is in a almost a brink of very bad situation. I learned through my experiences that many of the times I was surprised were because of things that never happened to me before in my lifetime, but happened many times in history. And the three things that drove me to study this 500 years of history and the patterns were: first, the creation of an enormous amount of debt and the monetization of that debt; second, the amounts of internal conflict between populists of the right and populists of the left, with the largest wealth and income gap since the 1930s; and third, the rise of a great power, comparable power to the United States in the form of China, to create a great power conflict between not just the United States and China, but also its allies. All three of those things I knew happened the last time in the 1930 to 45 period, but that's a sample size of one. And I needed to see the sample size of many cases. So I studied 10 major empires, the 10 most important ones, going back the last 500 years. And then I studied the dynasties in China since the Tang Dynasty, which is 600, to see that, that pattern and that cycle. And so, as you can imagine, each one is an issue. Each one is a problem. And when those three problems come together, that's a dangerous set of circumstances. So that's what, for example, today, financially, you have a situation where there's debt is a stimulant, another, or credit. You provide credit, you get debt. And so when you need a lot of buying power, central banks inject a lot of money and credit. And when it's not, when they don't have a limit on it, like in some eras, it was gold that was a limit. And they would think, how much money do I have? And that would affect how much they spend. That is no longer the case. So that there is that stimulant, but that stimulant of creating credit creates debt, which is an obligation for paying back, and it is an asset for somebody on the other side to hold, to think whether they're having a real return. So there's a mechanics to that set of circumstances. That means when you have a lot of debt and you have a lot of assets and liabilities that are there, you have to make both sides happy. And so the situation that we're going through is very much that. The coffers are empty. They needed to spend money, and they chose to spend a lot of money on debt. And that produced an inflation because it's buying power. It should not be surprising if you give everybody a lot of buying power, and it's much more than there is production. So there's a trade war, there's a technology war, there's a geopolitical influence war, then there's a capital and economic war that accelerates when there is this great power conflict, because it's the weaponization of capital markets and economies that are actually used to hurt the other. For example, in Japan, in the United States, they froze the financial assets, and they then also embargoed oil, that they couldn't get oil in. And so this economic warfare takes place. And then when the economic warfare becomes intolerable, then that often leads to a military war. For example, it was those military sanctions, that's economic warfare, that happened in Japan that led to Pearl Harbor beginning. That's a typical cycle. We know where we are. We don't necessarily have to go to cross those lines. Okay. So we do have our financial conditions, and we do have our internal conditions, which are leading to these irreconcilable differences. And we do have our international conditions in this economic warfare in this time. We are shifting the world. We moved from a world that was primarily resources were allocated on the basis of economic conditions and profitability. So that if it was economic to produce someplace, the capital would go there. And those who would earn the money would raise their living standards and so on. This is changing now. That the political or the geopolitical is more important than the economic profit system in allocating resources. So, for example, because that happened, we got Donald Trump becoming a populist because there was loss of jobs and so on. And those who want to fight for him are then becoming exerting forces, whether it's protectionism or nationalism, that is having an effect. The fact that we have conflicts now between countries and the possibility of wars means that being self-sufficient for countries is more important than it was in the past, where we had a globalized economy where you would produce it and move it to the most efficient places. That's ending, not only because of the political aspects that I'm talking about for what it means in countries' incomes and so on, but also because of the need for self-sufficiency. What happened in terms of the January 6th incident was not a surprise. Shouldn't be a surprise. It's right out of the populist handbook. So as you see these things, there's the worry of that. And then there's, of course, the international conflict, which I would say is also a 40% chance that you can have a type of international war. We went through where we are in terms of the wars and sanctions and so on. Does that go to another level? I can't say. There are contentious issues, seeming irreconcilable differences, for example, over Taiwan and so on. So that there are, such issues. I think the main thing here, we're right at the brink of that. We're dangerously close. You and I never would have had a conversation like this not many years ago. The fact that we all are having this conversation is indicative of where we've gone. And so, but we have to remember that it's really up to us. It all depends on how we are with each other. We can do this. I believe personally that it's very important that there's a strong bipartisan middle. I think one of the political problems that you have is when you have two parties, of which a significant number of those might represent rather extreme points of view. There is not a pulling together. Still, the majority of Americans are in the middle, but the two political parties are more extreme. Just let's escape a world in which we're thinking about profits and just think about what you want to accomplish. And rather than accumulating income has no purpose because there's no intrinsic value. And the only value is in what you do with your money. So when you step back and you say, okay, now what do you want to do with your money in terms of those things? And you realize that money has diminishing returns for you and it has enormous benefit for others in other ways, then there's how you go about doing that. So we do it as a family activity and we have a series of rules. In other words, how much you can give is a function of how much experience, how you've done it in the past, what are the credentials, the skills that you've built up, but it is your activity. So we pursue various activities that are extensions of the passions of those. And then we sort of break that down. What do we do for our community? What do we do for individuals? What do we do for the environment? And so my wife and I have a disproportionate amount of that giving. But as we view this over a period of time, the others are giving, and then they make that, and then we have to know how to give. The question is, how much income do you give up or do you not give up for the second bottom line? And then how do you measure the second bottom line? So it becomes a measurement question. For example, let's say I could earn 10% more in an economic investment than, let's say, a double bottom line. Then I think I can take that 10% and I can donate 10% more. So I seek to try to measure Okay, what is that impact? Of course, measurement is more difficult. So there's a certain art. So we're experimenting a lot with impact investing, and we found some very good. But so far, it's difficult to scale. A lot of demand for it. A lot of funds developed for it. But the rigor of it has not been very good because of a lot of the definition. What is an impact investing? And what gets the stamp? In other words, if I don't know, for example, somebody could say, if I invest in a bowling alley, I'm giving people exercise. I mean, I'm just giving that as a silly example. But in other words, how do you measure those impacts and really what it is? So it's a terrific concept. It's emerging. It's good, but it is in its early stages and it's difficult to measure.